You're locked on to the SABC News channel this Saturday afternoon. While the attacks on foreign nationals in Durban has again thrown sharp focus on efforts to successfully integrate immigrants into society. Now, these incidents have a direct impact on stability at local, community and national level. To discuss what's actually unfolding in Durban right now and how locals and society groups can work together with government to promote successful integration is Sharon Ekambaram. She's the head of the Refugee and Migrants Rights Program at Lawyers for Human Rights. Good afternoon, Sharon, and thank you for making time for us on the weekend at that.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
Sharon, some distressing images coming out of Durban, KwaZulu-Natal this week, and it's not for the first time. I mean, it's apparent that violence of this nature is a direct result of the socio-economic circumstances that people in this particular communities find themselves.
Absolutely, and I think we've seen this pattern going back to the 2008 xenophobic violence, 2016, this year again, and it is the socioeconomic inequalities, the poverty, the conditions that people live under, high levels of unemployment, but it is unfortunately scapegoating. It's the consequence of leaders, of political parties that are scraping the bottom of the barrel to blame migrants for issues that they have failed to address, and that is what we're talking about, of ensuring that people have decent jobs, have proper accommodation, and in blaming migrants for all these problems, and that's what fuels the violence.
The KwaZulu-Natal Premier and the MECs, and you've mentioned the 2015-2016 violence as well, they've not implemented their own commission's findings and recommendations related to those attacks. What kind of monitoring mechanisms do you think we need to have in place to avoid a constant reoccurrence of flare-up of violence of this nature, Sharon?
Well, I think the bottom line is we've got to address the inequalities. That is the bottom line. That's the problem. There's also a need to manage movement in our region, and I want to speak about that later, but I also want to make the point that following the 2008 xenophobic violence, the South African Human Rights Commission conducted an investigation into the violence, and it was under the instruction or the calling of the Consortium for Refugees and Migrants in South Africa. So a very comprehensive report was provided in 2009, which made extensive recommendations to every single department, to Chapter 9 institutions, and we are seeing that there's complete disrespect for these recommendations. They're not taken seriously. Now, to come to the more recent developments, the United Nations High Commission for Refugees working in South Africa is working with civil society, with various organizations, including Lawyers for Human Rights and others, and through the Protection Working Group, we're beginning to set up an emergency response, which would help to respond, but that's after the violence has taken place. We do need to consider as a nation, as people who should be champions of human rights, what do we do to address this violence, to prevent it from taking place? And it is xenophobic. More than xenophobic, it's targeting our black brothers and sisters from the African continent, and that's what's so disconcerting in our situation.
All right, you've mentioned the 2008 violence. Now, back then, if I remember correctly, we had a three-pronged approach to this. It was to prevent the violence, of course, provide the humanitarian aid, and then reintegrate those who were displaced. But that integration was based on some sort of agreement that was reached with the communities. Clearly, this strategy hasn't worked long-term. Why is this?
I have to go back to my point that political leaders are making incredibly reckless statements, and that's part of the agreement, that there should not be scapegoating. We should not be blaming migrants for the problems in our country. Another thing that was emphasized and was called upon is for proper disaggregated data about movement in our country. We don't know the extent to which it's internal movement. We've seen an organization called FOOTSAC formed in the Western Cape to keep people from the Eastern Cape out of the Western Cape. That's internal migration. We know Gauteng has a similar situation of a number of people from the neighboring provinces coming into Gauteng. Now, how do we budget for that? How do we take that into account in our planning to make sure that service delivery meets the needs and the demands of the communities? Do we know what the needs are and what are we responding to.
I just want to go back to your earlier point about inequality. The National Development Plan sets 2030 as a vision, as a goal for us as South Africans, to be more conscious of the things we have in common than our differences in terms of social cohesion and nation building. But still we have these flare-ups of incidents of violence of this nature occurring in various communities across the nation. Speak to us about this relationship between social cohesion and economic inequality, and what kind of institutional changes we need to see on the ground to promote social cohesion.
I think you've mentioned it, and again I want to emphasize that unless we can reduce the very high levels of chronic unemployment in our country, and it's actually amongst the youngest people. We have like over 50% unemployment of young people.
Youth unemployment,
and
yes.
That's an incredible indictment on the ruling party. More than the National Development Plan, we have something that has just been launched called the National Action Plan by the Department of Justice to deal with xenophobia, to deal with racism in our country. We need political will to ensure that all these brilliant plans and clear strategies that have been thought through are actually implemented. And I think I just want to make this point that what we're seeing on a daily basis is an infringement of policy that exists in our country. The law enforcement is incredibly xenophobic. As we speak here today, we find that police are looting shops of foreign nationals. You know, human rights has been suspended. If you're a foreign national, disrespect for your dignity, and we have to ask the question why. What does our constitution mean? Is it worth the paper it's written on where it's enshrined that every person living in this country has the right to basic human rights and dignity? That's critical given our past and where we come from. And we feel there's a serious problem with the police and the way in which their Operation Fiela completely puts the constitution on hold. And we can't, as people living in this country, allow this to continue. There has to be something done about the manner in which law enforcement agents in particular target foreign nationals. And I just want to add that many South Africans bear the brunt of this as well. If you've got a darker skin, you're assumed to be a foreign national. Now, where does that come from? Does that come from our past? Isn't that the past law system? Isn't that the way in which the segregated policies of the apartheid system carried and enforced its legislation?
Sharon, I do wish we had more time to chat, but unfortunately this is where we have to leave it for this afternoon. That was Sharon Ekambaram joining us from Lawyers for Human Rights.